Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first seminar for the City Institute at York University for the academic year 2021 to 2022. We have a fantastic panel awaiting you to be talking about the very current topic of the impact of the federal election on the GTA. But before we go on to introduce the panel and the convener, who is Professor Patricia Wood from the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, I'd like us to start. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Métis, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, the meeting place of Toronto, from the Haudenosaunee word Takaronto, is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this territory. Thank you. And I'm going to hand you over then at this stage to Professor Patricia Wood.
Thanks very much, Linda. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. It was an election called 2 years early without a clear rationale at the start of the school year and in the middle of a still ongoing pandemic. And it seems to have left us pretty much where we started. At least 25 ridings changed parties, but it amounted to tiny changes in the number of seats won and equally small changes in the popular vote distribution. And yet, election campaigns require parties to speak to us of their visions, to make promises to us, and to discuss issues in more depth and with more media coverage and scrutiny than usual. So our question today really is, did anything change? And what does it mean for us here in Toronto and in the Greater Toronto area? I'm happy to introduce three panelists today who are going to help us sort this out. First, we have Saman Tabasinejad from Progress Toronto, John Lawrence, Toronto journalist, the senior editing at Spacing Toronto, and Shannon Holness, development planning, policy and design researcher with SHS Consulting. Saman is the project manager at Progress Toronto. She's got degrees in political science and anthropology. She's particularly interested in how large policy decisions affect everyday lives. She knows that meaningful change cannot be achieved unless actions that address and remove systemic barriers are taken. In 2018, Saman actually ran for office herself in North York, and she recently worked at the Duke Heights BIA in the neighborhood of York University, at the Downsview Advocate, and is the policy chair of the Iranian Canadian Congress. Saman has also served on the executive of Roofs for Refugees, pairing newly arrived refugees with homes, and has spent time organizing with immigrant communities. She's dedicated to building a progressive city and making room for women, especially young racialized women, to take space, influence policymaking, and run for office. John is a Toronto freelance journalist, editor, and ghostwriter. He specializes in politics, urban affairs, the environment, technology, and business. He's contributed to numerous national and local publications, including the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, Spacing, Walrus, Canadian Business, Reader's Digest, Cottage Life, Atlantic Cities, and the New York Times. John is the author of 3 books, including The New City in 2006, which was selected as a Globe and Mail Top 100 book for 2006 and one I've used in my teaching. And he has co-edited 5 Coach House Toronto anthologies, including House Divided in 2019. Shannon's work at SHS Consulting involves contributing to the planning approval process for affordable housing projects, conducting research contributing to the development of housing policy, and participating in community engagement processes to ensure the voice of the community is heard in all aspects of affordable housing. Shannon's background and education are in urban planning and include experiences in community development, public engagement, and municipal planning. She also brings strong insight into affordable housing issues and concerns through her lived experience growing up within a social housing community in Toronto. Shannon is also specifically a York University alumna. She has a BA in Human Rights and Equity Studies and a master's degree in Environmental Studies from York. So with those introductions, I'm sure you'll agree we have a very able panel to help us sort through what this election campaign and results mean for us. I'd like to invite each of the panelists to just give us kind of 5 to 7 minute summary of what they think the most significant aspects of the campaign and the results are. Saman, if you would begin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I'm really excited to be sharing this space with everyone, including John and Shannon. Shannon actually is also a Progress Runner advisor, and I've worked in the same office as her once upon a time and back in the day. So it's nice to digitally share space. Yeah, Monday's election was definitely a whirlwind for those people, for those who were involved in the election, for the public in general, for advocates who were trying to get certain issues onto the party's vision and in their platforms. It was exhausting, especially on the heels of the fourth wave, like Professor Ward just said, and also right at the end of a summer and in the beginning of a very hectic school year. So in many ways, a little has changed in terms of seats from the last election. However, there's a mandate for this minority government to address issues like housing, and I think the climate as well, especially since I think it's the first time that we've seen all the major parties sort of show up on these issues to varying degrees. Obviously, maybe not as much as we would like, but we know that, for instance, housing was a major top issue for voters, and it was something that a lot of, and it kind of overtook the economy, and that became the forefront of a lot of the party's platforms. And I see this as really an opportunity. We're kind of in this weird moment in politics, where there's probably not going to be another election for at least another 2 years, we hope, federally at least. And there needs to be, because the public came out again demanding a minority government, none of the parties really feel safe. So it's definitely an opportunity to be pushing some popular policies. And that is a good news, I think, for municipalities to push for popular investments like transit, like housing, like climate. So we all know that the need for cities to invest in much more in affordable housing and road safety and safer and reliable TTC and expand services like childcare has become crystal clear in the last couple of years of the pandemic. And one thing I'm going to speak about today is the fact that we need a new deal, a new legal relationship, and more consistent funding for Toronto from the federal government as well as the provincial, but today we'll talk about specifically the federal, so we can break the cycle of underfunding and growing inequality in our city. There are a number of plans and strategies that have already passed City Council, but still they're failed to be budgeted for. In other words, we have a roadmap to address some of our biggest challenges, but not funding. For instance, the poverty reduction strategy has aspects of it that are still underfunded, and we're not implementing the strategy in the full way we need to. And then actually in 2020, Progress Toronto launched a campaign calling for a new deal for Toronto, because we know that there needs to be a more sustainable relationship between municipalities and different levels of government. And budget cycle after budget cycle, Toronto is faced with revenue shortfalls and the inability to decide its own future. We're seeing that result across our infrastructure, across our housing, across transit, and there really needs to be a change. So we weigh on other levels of government to roll out their plans for housing and childcare and transit more. However, there are a lot of these areas are actually very important and fall onto municipalities' shoulders many times, but they don't have the funding to deal with it. So with this minority government, I think there can be really big pushes for municipal investment, especially within the realms of housing and childcare and climate. The Liberal government will need support from both the NDP and the Bloc to push forward some progressive issues, and this is their chance to be more bold. And it's also our chance to be more bold in order to secure support for more popular legislation like childcare, like housing and climate. And so, there are really amazing parts in each of the platforms of the Liberal and the NDP government, especially with regard to housing. The Liberals actually explicitly included legislating inclusionary zoning, and that's an issue that Progress Toronto has been campaigning on, and strong inclusionary zoning would mean a lot for our city. Inclusionary zoning really, for those who are not familiar, means that new developments will be new developments will be forced to set aside a certain number of affordable housing units as rental units in order to have that development fulfilled. So that's one thing that we can really push for, a strong inclusionary zoning policy, especially since we see that coming to City Council in the next couple of months, actually. And maybe that's a little bit of a short time frame, but this is an opportunity. There is an opportunity there. And the NDP has had a goal of building 500,000 affordable housing units across Canada. What does that mean in terms of Toronto and the GTA? Well, considering that we are the most populous city, and the GTHA is also greatly populous, it bodes well in trying to push the Liberal minority government. Will push the NDP to push the Liberal minority government to actually come through with that 500,000 affordable housing units. And like I mentioned earlier, affordable housing is the top of mind of a lot of voters. And this minority government, I think that we can all agree that all the parties sort of underperformed in in getting power. The Liberals wanted to call this election to secure a majority. That didn't happen. So there needs to be some popular policies that they pass that they can later on point to. So this housing could be a really good option for that. So it's an opportunity for advocates to push the NDP and even the Bloc. Well, we don't have really access to the Bloc, but the NDP to be able to do that. And another obvious point is transit. In both the Liberal and the NDP's commitments, they want to invest billions of dollars into transit projects across the country. And the NDP specifically had outlined plans to move towards zero emission transit and electric trains. And as the calls move towards mass transit, become more and more integral part and more like louder and more of an integral part of addressing the climate crisis, I also think that pushing a federal transit plan, especially in terms of funding municipalities to fund and build and invest in their own capital projects, is a really great opportunity. So there are I personally believe that there is a lot of potential for a new federal government, especially since we seem to be transitioning into a recovery moment. And it's a recovery moment that this is probably a moment where there's going to be key investments, giant investments made by the federal government into capital projects, into municipal governments, into healthcare infrastructure, and other types of infrastructure. And it's going to be key if they are serious about going towards a green and just recovery. And so we all know that for decades, the provincial and federal governments have underfunded local services, including the TTC. In Toronto, we have the most expensive childcare in the country, and the childcare plan in Toronto has been behind the past few years, and there's a deadly lack of funding for shelters and permanent affordable housing. And these are just kind of the tip of the iceberg that I'm sure my co-panelists will get more into, but this is really an opportunity to push those big issues that are top of mind for folks in Toronto onto the radar of the minority government, especially as we saw that a number of the elections in Toronto were extremely close between the Liberal and the NDP. So winning on a few key of these items is totally within purview, especially considering that these are much sought after seats. So all this to say is that I know I'm running out of time. This is a good opportunity to secure more of a sustainable relationship with the federal government and making sure that Toronto has the tools it needs to succeed, including revenue tools that I didn't really get into, but hopefully we can get into more later. And of course, Progress Toronto, we don't believe that the government or the minority government or even other parties will do this out of goodwill. We believe that there needs to be a grassroots effort and push to ensure that the federal government will go through these promises. So we need to advocate and pressure the government to make sure that the cities get the best deal possible. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Could I turn it over to John, please, for your thoughts?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me. And Saman's presentation was really interesting and touched on a lot of points that I'm going to mention, and I think we'll be discussing in the next hour or so. My big point in my takeaway from this election is the following: that while sort of the conventional wisdom and a lot of the discussion in the media has been that the before and after are not really very different at all, that so why did we go through this exercise? My argument is that that what we're looking at is a minority government that will probably last for at least 3 years, if not more, given how unhappy a lot of people were about having this election. And so the consequence of that is that Canada will be governed by sort of a center-left minority government for 5 or possibly 6 years, which is unprecedented in our history. So we know that sort of left of center minority governments produce really good, solid policy, especially aimed at cities. There have been lots of benefits, from the 1970s during the minority governments with Pierre Trudeau as the prime minister. And then in the 2004 to 2006 period, when Paul Martin was prime minister of a minority government, Jack Layton, who was then the NDP leader, pushed for a lot of progressive urban-focused policies like the federal gas tax and some renewable energy policies. So I actually see that this period that we're looking at has enormous opportunity and is actually different, because it the complaining about the election I think was heard loud and clear by all the parties. And so while there's a bit of chicken involved in negotiating what deals get done between the ruling governing party, the Liberals, and the NDP and the Bloc, I think everybody around the table understands that they've got to figure out how to make it work. And the way that's going to happen is that it's going to lean to the left, which is good news for cities. So there are a bunch of things that I'm looking for, that I'm curious about, and that I've been writing about in the last little bit. And so I'll just run down those. So obviously the affordability is a huge issue. And it's not just about the price of housing and the price of rent. Affordability is about household income. And I think one of the really, really important early steps in this government is the finalization of a negotiation over a Ontario-Ottawa childcare agreement that flows from the childcare promises that the federal government made in its last budget. So there isn't an agreement in place yet, I don't believe, although I stand to be corrected if I'm wrong about that. And bringing that new type of childcare framework into Ontario will have a significant impact on household finances. And so it's a really, really important priority. And it will help a lot of the families that have been significantly disadvantaged by the high cost of housing, the very high cost of living that we're seeing at the moment, with the increase in price of groceries and other commodities. So that's one point. The second point has to do with the translation of like interesting and progressive and policy into actual implemented results. And so there are examples in both the climate and the housing file where high level policies that are aimed at climate reduction, climate change, emissions reduction, new affordable housing projects have been significantly slowed because of a regulatory approvals process, a bureaucratic approvals process. And I'm not here to kind of, sort of wave the flag about, cutting red tape and so on, but it is recognized as a problem in the affordable housing space. For example, in Toronto, there are the mayor at the beginning of his current term made this promise about 12,000 housing units, 40,000 housing units in 12 years, with many deeply affordable housing projects. And that whole program, which is called Housing Now, is premised on accessing federal CMHC financing. And what's happened in the last year and a half is that there's been a real slowdown as a result of the negotiations that are quite protracted, that are required to sort of secure that financing. So the federal government wants to spend the money. The city wants to create the housing and has put up land. But there are these regulatory and bureaucratic obstacles that are preventing shovels from going into the ground. And I really hope that the federal government, and encouraged by the opposition parties who are basically on the same page about this issue, are going to find ways of expediting those processes. And we know that that's possible because during the pandemic, CMHC, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, was able to fast track financing for modular housing for very low income and hard to house people. And we've seen several of those projects approved, constructed quite quickly. So where there's a will, there's a way. And I'm hoping that, a lot of energy will be applied to kind of loosening up those log jams. A similar set of log jams exist in the climate file. And one of the topics that I'm especially interested in and has relevance to cities in parts of the country that where there's a lot of natural gas used for home heating and water heating is our policies designed to allow building owners, homeowners to significantly reduce their dependence on natural gas as a space heating fuel and switch over to electric, electric or geothermal or other forms of renewable heat. And this sounds like a very niche topic, but it's the emissions in the city of Toronto that are related to natural gas use in homes and buildings is 50%. So half of all the emissions generated in the city come from natural gas. And we went to natural gas 30 years ago because it was considered to be cleaner than home heating oil, and that's true. And it is still a very inexpensive fuel, but it is adding to our carbon output, and it's problematic. And so so this is the second thing that I'm hoping, or the third thing I'm hoping that that this government focuses on, is finding ways to really incent that transition, the fuel transition from natural gas to electricity, to bring down the consumption of natural gas in a very substantial way. And this is possible. It's being done in BC. There's some efforts in Quebec to do it. In several jurisdictions in the United States, municipalities have blocked have passed bylaws that prevent new home construction and new building construction from using natural gas as a heating source. So these are non-trivial decisions, and I want to see some leadership from the federal government on that. And the very last thing I'll say is about transit. During the pandemic, the federal government bailed out major transit agencies that saw, like, ridership basically collapse. And that money is not going to be around forever. As far as I understand, it was a one-time contribution to operating budgets. I argued recently in spacing that the federal government should look at transitional subsidies to operating budgets from transit agencies that would allow transit agencies to find ways of rebuilding ridership in a very intentional way. Ridership is going to be an issue for many years to come because, changing work habits, people working from home or hybrid work arrangements that basically undercut transit usage. And so we need some leadership to figure out how to sort of address that situation and how to address the finances of municipal transit agencies, and to prevent them from going into a downward spiral where where the subsidy has to get larger and larger, and the transit agency management is tempted to cut back service. And then the related issue on with transit is that we have been building very ineffective transit in the past couple of decades. We have an obsession with rail transit, very large projects, very, very expensive, slow to complete, that reach far out into the hinterland. And what the last thing I'm going to say is that I'm hoping that the federal government, through a coalition, can press the province and the municipalities to encourage bus rapid transit, and which can significantly improve service levels in lower or medium density communities. Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much, John. So we have two fairly encouraging replies so far, or responses. Shannon, would you give us your thoughts, please?
Hi, everyone. Saman, it's great to be on this panel with you. Likewise, John. Thank you, York University, my alma mater, for asking me to be on this panel. I feel humbled, and I liked what I heard in terms of the first couple of panelists. And I think that what I will do, because both spoke at length on the, I guess, challenges and opportunities, I think I'll just reflect back some personal anecdotes on my experience working in planning, and how some of the, and actually even getting to work, and how some of the, I guess, platforms of the parties can be more responsive to that journey. So my first planning job was in Essa Township, which is a municipality that sits just outside of Barrie. It is a small township of about 20,000 people. And I had to purchase a vehicle in order to access that job opportunity, because that municipality had no transit system. And the only transit was offered at the border of another municipality, which I don't remember the name of, and Essa Township. And so when you're looking at implementing solutions for communities, there does have to be an investment in creating more active transit mobility options for folks who live in municipalities that are maybe low density. And I think that that is one of the more glaring challenges when it comes to access to services and the differing levels of the market basket of goods that a municipality is able to offer its local residents. And usually density is used as an indicator for the investment in transit or housing. For example, some municipalities may not be eligible for some of the programs and initiatives out of the CMHC for any housing innovation, housing innovation strategies. And so I think while the density is the rationale behind municipalities being ineligible for some funding, it does limit opportunities for those municipalities to kind of grow in a particular way. And so that's something that I thought about while I was working in the township of Essa. And I guess the other thing that I would like to reflect on is what I heard years ago when I was doing my community grassroots work in Jane Finch, and I was offered an opportunity to attend the consultations for the National Housing Strategy, which is being implemented across Canada now, is that there were a lot of folks from the grassroots level who said, put the money into our hands and we will house our communities. We know how to provide the services. We know the resources that are required for tenant success. And so I think that one of the things that I appreciate about the housing strategy as it is now is that it is making good on that request from and demand from local grassroots groups to put the money back into the hands of the community so that they can house communities better. And so I look at examples like the investment in Armagh Transitional House, which is in Mississauga. And they have received funding. If you look on the CMH's website, they have received funding for in a partnership with the region of Peel to provide transitional housing for women escaping domestic abuse. So that's an example of a local organization being able to provide housing for its service users. And then I look at the Hogan's Alley Society in British Columbia that was able to get housing innovation funding to provide a strategy for purpose-built rental for harder to house members of the Black and Indigenous community. So when I think of the opportunities, I think that there's a lot in terms of addressing some of the housing challenges that more harder to house people are facing, but I also think of the ways in which the grassroots are able to kind of organize for these types of funding opportunities to provide responses to deeper housing challenges. And then I also think about what the, I guess, calculations are and how those can be kind of changed to help support communities that are in the GTA, but may not have, GTHA, sorry, but may not have the, I guess, the right density to kind of be eligible for those resources, because housing need exists out there as well. And I think that that is one of the things we have to think about is how are we resolving housing issues out there, aside from the NIMBYism, for example, that can kind of create challenges in the planning approvals process. What exactly are the opportunities there? And so that's my thoughts on it.
And thank you for mentioning in particular intercity transit and getting us thinking about connectivity within the region as well as within the city of Toronto as, you know, fundamentally urban issues. And a number of you mentioned some optimism specifically because it's a minority government and there were some close races in the city with the NDP. It is still striking that the entire city and almost the entire GTA is just a blanket of Liberal seats, and that even candidates who are not very well known, or in at least one case were disavowed by the Liberal Party, were nonetheless elected. And somebody commented to me that they recently that they thought you could run an empty chair with a Liberal sign on it in the city of Toronto and it would win. Are we well served, you know, because, you know, by being under this kind of Liberal blanket? Does that mean suggested like they're going to keep working for those seats to make sure they stay out of NDP hands, or they're, you know, or this now is a region that's very important to them, or are they going to take it a little bit more for granted? How do you think it affects the city and the region for it to be so singularly represented?
I think it depends on how the grassroots reacts to this, right? I think to me, elections are just a flash in the pan. You know, it's unfortunate that we have like, not necessarily unfortunate, but I do think that some of those really close races, it does feel like the city isn't so as on the same level. I don't think this is like necessarily everyone in Toronto agrees with the Liberal platform, and it's unfortunate there isn't more diversity in the seats. However, I do think that it is an opportunity for grassroots advocates to actually engage with the issues at hand a little bit more deeper, or start organizing on the issues. Because I think that the NDP, and kind of saw this with Paul Taylor before he was elected, he kind of was everywhere. I'm pretty surprised that he didn't win his election, because he was already a leader in his own right, because he was always on CTV and City TV and sort of sharing his perspective on the different issues, far beyond just the food share and food security. So I do think that there is sort of a perspective that not only within the downtown ridings or just the GTHA, because it's become so red, that they need to do that to maintain their seats. I think that the Liberals in Ottawa, or maybe I can only imagine that Liberals in Ottawa now are starting to feel, okay, their vote share actually has gone down. This was supposed to be an easy kind of way to win a majority government, and it didn't happen. And so what can we do to kind of set ourselves up for the best majority government? And the NDP is going to do its best to also push a progressive platform in order to make their case. So I think that they don't know when the next snap election is going to come, and it is an opportunity. I think all the parties are going to kind of be trying to make their mark as much as possible in order to do that. And I'll let other folks respond. I see that there's an interesting question in the Q&A.
Mm-hmm. John?
I think that part of the reason that we saw this result is that the turnout was low, and the turnout was low because people were not interested in the election, or people stayed away because of the pandemic, and concerns about COVID. So it's a little bit artificial. Toronto has been very liberal for a long time. Whether that's a good thing or not, I'm not sure. My general observation is that federal Liberals took Toronto votes more for granted in the past than they have in more recent years. My general view is that a minority government that's strongly influenced by both the Bloc and the NDP, which are progressive parties with strong urban bases, is going to produce strong urban policy, which will benefit cities, including Toronto.
Shannon, what are your thoughts on the Liberal blanket?
I think it might just be a symptom of people going with what they're used to. In my writing, I've had the same candidate since 1999. And so I think that that's one of the bigger challenges is it really does sometimes boil down to name recognition and familiarity. And so it's hard to kind of break that kind of tradition in some communities like mine. But I also think that in reflecting on conversations leading up to the elections, there is still a skepticism that a very, very left platform will kind of reflect kind of deliver on what the promises are. And so that's a real comment as well. Real commentary that I've heard from folks as well is how can we achieve anything? We still need the cooperation of, for example, corporations. We want them to stay in our country. So I think that those are not my personal beliefs. Those are just things that I hear when talking about elections that people do get concerned about or apprehensive about is their own, how will the impact what impact would be made on their day-to-day lives. And so people kind of vote in a way that kind of promotes that kind of predictability for themselves. And I also think that one of the things that was difficult to observe was a growing divide in terms of, I know we're focusing on NDP and Liberal, but I also know that there was a healthy conservative bent, especially in my community, where it was very, very challenging to kind of see people leaning that way, not making any judgment calls on people, but it was very challenging to see people leaning that way because they felt frustrated by some of the, and people feel like progress hasn't been made. So it's like, what exactly has the real impact of, a progressive, I guess, policies in people's daily lives? Have they felt it? And a lot of people might say no and be not sure who to vote for. So those are my initial thoughts on it. Yeah.
No, thank you. I think it's interesting the durability of the Liberal vote at the federal level in Toronto, because of course, if we look at the provincial level, it's much more mixed across the region. But at the federal level, the incumbency factor that you mentioned and others that the others have mentioned as well. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I think that another aspect is definitely fear, right? Like, especially in the last 2 weeks, we saw the Liberals really campaigning on strategic voting. And that fear, like, I don't think that there is a galvanized vote necessarily behind the Liberal parties. Like, I think what Shannon said is correct. People do it out of habit, and sort of like, we know that this is not going to hurt us any more than it's already been hurting us, that type of thing, or like the evil, or whatever. Not to say like Liberals are evil, but that sort of not wanting to change because it's what we've always known. And then that fear of, oh, are we going to have O2 again, or it's going to be a Harper 2.0, and then being scared of that, and then being more kind of dedicated into and digging their heels more into their Liberal vote. But I do think that closeness of the votes in some of the ridings shows that there has to be like some concessions made, more concessions than the Liberals made in the past, to a more like progressive wing of the parliament.
What's interesting too is the question of where the right is in this region. I saw signs for not just the Conservatives, but the PPC. I don't know if I saw any in the city of Toronto, but I certainly saw some in Toronto suburbs during the campaign. That's new. And we know that overall their vote share went up. I mean, it's still a very tiny percentage, but that's a presence. And I wonder how significant that is when we think of municipal councils in the GTA. Although they don't have parties, they are by and large fairly conservative bodies, or dominated by conservative politicians. So I wonder if there's even some balancing going on. John, sorry, I think you signaled you wanted to join in.
Oh, I just on the last question, I was just going to say that in most big cities, the political representation is center, slightly left. And this is like all over the place. And it's because cities, because of their density, require sort of a more collectivist approach to governing, but also because they're large and successful economically, that there's going to be, a lot of people who are interested in, sort of private enterprise, investment, and so on. And, it's all over, all over Europe, all over North America. This is the type of political alignment that you see. And I don't think that we're really all that different from that.
I wanted to, I have a couple more questions on this, but I also wanted to draw everyone's attention to the Q&A button that's on the bottom of your screen. for the audience to submit questions there as well. You can do that at any time and we'll get a running list. And in fact, I want to pick up on one that's been posted, which asks the panelists to address the issue of democracy, more broadly speaking, in the election. The question of structural reform in terms of the vote, right? In terms of some kind of electoral reform, proportional representation, what have you, are given the turnout and how it doesn't represent the diversity of political opinion in the region to have every riding represented by the Liberals. Are we well served by the current, like cities and Toronto, are we well served by that, or would electoral reform of some kind also be of benefit to Toronto and the Toronto region? What do you think?
I can take this question if no one else has, like, I just have been thinking about it because I've been looking at the questions. Yeah. So I think that there needs to be a push for electoral reform. I can imagine it even being a grassroots push, even by conservatives, since the conservatives did win technically the most percentage. So I feel like there will be, and maybe conservatives might disagree with me, but I think there might be some sort of general push towards more of an electoral reform, because there's a lot of cynicism that has been kind of brewing, and Shannon made a good point, where maybe folks who have been voting quote unquote progressive, liberal or NDP, and then that sort of center left or that sort of government hasn't been fulfilling the promises that it's been making, and has led to a lot of cynicism. And it's also leading a lot of cynicism when they do vote for the non-winning party. So it might restore some respect or faith in democracy if we do move to a proportional mixed member proportional representation. And I do want to touch on the point, Professor Wood, that you made earlier about the city council makeup and how it does tend to skew a lot more conservative. I think it's more conservative than even than the Conservative Party sometimes. Like, I think conservatives on the city council make conservatives other places like look way more progressive, which is wild to say. But sometimes you get these, I think, deeply traumatizing conversations at city council when they talk about whether or not the public should have access to public bathrooms, which is just wild. But in that being said, I think that there definitely needs to be, like, the democracy on the local level, and our local democracy is obviously very fraught, and slashing a council led to that. But beyond that, because there are no parties, what Shannon had said earlier rings even truer with the name recognition and people just voting for who they always seem to be in that position.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts about democracy and electoral reform and how it might benefit or hurt Toronto and the Toronto region? Didn't really get talked about in the election until kind of the very last moments. John, go ahead, please.
So I'm just going to take an alternative view. So my reading of of Trudeau's promise to do electoral reform in 2016 was simply about getting exercise with a very narrow target audience, and it didn't surprise me in the least that he backed away from it. And my general view on this is that it's an unproven proposition that electoral reform will produce something better in whatever way you want to describe it, more progressive, more conservative. We don't know. And so my view is, beware of what you wish for, because I think that, there's lots of evidence in how to show that, the systems can be gamed And I think rank ballots can be gamed. I think proportional representation can be gamed. I'm personally glad that we did not have PR in this election, because Maxime Bernier would have a lot of seats in the House of Commons, and I'm not sure that that's something that that's a pretty good example of unintended consequences.
Shannon, any thoughts on, are you in favor of electoral reform? Do you think it's even a priority issue for cities?
I would say that we would have to start with a lot of civic engagement for people to keep kind of even understand the implications of that, because I'm one of those people who would benefit from that. A lot of folks are, especially like millennials, not to speak on everybody, there are people who are out there like Saman who know exactly what's going on. And then there are some of us who are just kind of awakening to the reality of how deeply politics play an impact in our lives, and when governments and different parties do play politics, how much of a cost that has on seeing real changes happen. And so I think that before discussions about that happen, there would really need to be some type of initiative to educate people, because we do have a low voter turnout to begin with. Why would we want to confuse things? There's also that perspective for a lot of people. I know personally, I brought my little sister, she's 12 today, to the ballot box. She went with my older sister and she saw the whole process. And so I think that people really need to kind of engage with civic life in a meaningful way before we have those kinds of discussions. But I mean, chicken and egg, that might actually help people become involved. But I do think that there's a fundamental lack of understanding that people might have. And so how do we address that?
Yeah, engagement is always a critical question at all scales, obviously. John, please go ahead.
Just very quickly, I think one answer, small answer that's come up in the last little bit, is to allow voting on Sundays, have an election week instead of an election day, and create the conditions that enable more participation.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. I think though, in terms of the conversation around PR and electoral reform, I don't think that saying, okay, well, maybe some fringe groups might get some power, then that's a good reason not to have electoral reform. Only insofar as I think that those fringe groups are coming into play and they're resonating with more and more Canadians and citizens, because there's deep cynicism within our political process, and people don't feel like there's a point in voting, or they want to elect someone to completely destroy the system or whatnot. And that's all to say, obviously we wouldn't want people to vote PPC, or they're I don't want there to be members of PPC, but that means that we need to organize for that, rather than sort of, in my opinion, hinder a democratic process or make our systems more democratic. Because I think that I think they doubled their vote share this time around. It's only going to get worse unless, and if you speak to PPC voters, a lot of folks are just deeply cynical and distrustful of the systems around them. And the person who ran in my neighborhood was racialized. He definitely didn't come from didn't seem like he came from a very privileged background. And so I think there's a danger. The biggest danger in not making our systems more democratic is that we're pushing people or creating a deep-seated cynicism in democracy and in our in government, and they feel okay, they're getting pushed, nothing they can do is going to be represented in government, and I think it'd just be easier to organize people into believing in the government. democracy at least.
I think there are a couple of really interesting aspects being raised here. So one is engagement, and there's a question in the chat that speaks to that, particularly about engaging and informing, marginalized groups about, who their reps are, who their candidates are, what the issues are, and I think this also needs, thinking of Shannon's comments, to happen outside of election time as well. But then there's this other question. It's related, but not quite the same, which is, I think there's a common assumption already here that more democracy in cities means more progressive government. That there's this kind of assumption that the dominant political opinion in cities is progressive. And so we want more democracy if it's enabling that, and maybe we want not as much democracy, or a different kind of democracy if it's not going to enable that, which is a different. Any thoughts on like what are the priorities for democracy in the city, and how are they related to federal politics?
I think that what the federal government can make promises about progressive policy, deliver on those promises, make people's lives better, right? So provide very affordable daycare or childcare, provide, allow for the construction of new affordable housing, those kind of things. Then you get this virtuous circle, which exists in many in many places, and sort of could be better here, where people see the benefits of paying taxes, of participating in democracy. And I think that has a sort of a spillover effect, right? And it works against this process that Saman described, where you have this alienation, people who are alienated from the system, either because of all the crap on social media, or because of just the drift in their own views or fear or whatever. So to my mind, the relationship has to do with the federal government just being very effective in doing the things that it says it's going to do.
Shannon, go ahead.
I'm just thinking, because that makes me think about the child daycare issue, which was just raised. But the fact that I watched a lot of coverage on this past election, and I remember hearing on 2 occasions that the other parties, because it was a minority government, other parties didn't want to kind of move on certain policy issues, kind of gave the Liberal government a bit of a hard time. And I'm sure they'll also, if any party was the leader, had leadership, but had to kind of, I guess, negotiate with the other parties for decision and consensus, there would be those challenges. But I did hear a couple of federal folks in the seats, federal folks who have seats, say that, we did experience some slowing down of major policy from the NDP, for example. And so there's that level of, I guess, of a barrier that's posed on the federal level. But then when you're talking about the provincial level, and the fact that, for example, I know with the CERB benefits and the transitioning out of CERB into, I guess, more of an EI, employment insurance situation, the federal government did pump money into into Queen's Park to be able to address those issues. However, the provincial government had different ideas on how to spend that money than what it was kind of entitled to be, how it was supposed to be spent. And so that's something that I'm thinking about when I hear John's comments. And then this is the same case with childcare. And I know that the last thing I heard Justin Trudeau say about childcare in Ontario was that our premier didn't necessarily have the same vision for implementing childcare and wasn't on the same page. And so I think that we do kind of have to think about, where quote unquote politics can be played, and the impact that this chain of bureaucracy does have on, realizing some of the more progressive outcomes that are promised in the federal, the federal promises. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking is the biggest thing, is like, what are the levels and how do we get people to kind of think about that engagement?
Thank you. There are a couple of questions in the chat that are encouraging us to get into the weeds on a couple of questions. The first one is, can we talk more about transit for Toronto? What specific opportunities do you see for more investment in Toronto over the next little while? I know, John, you at least touched on that. And I think Shannon did in a different way in terms of intercity transit. So any thoughts on what we think, what are the most important priorities, and what opportunities do you see? What do you think is going to come down from the new, the new or renewed minority Liberal government?
Yeah, in terms of transit, I think there's a big opportunity to push for like deep investment, especially within the city, but as Shannon pointed out, in intracity investment, especially after the cancellation of Greyhound. I think that a lot of communities are looking for a way to be interconnected, and we all know that those, like, transit isn't a standalone issue. We also know it's a gendered issue. We also know it's a racial issue. So we need to, like, those intersections matter in both the way that the federal government will implement, or if they'll implement, but also how advocates push for it. And I think I saw in the NDP's platform, and maybe it was the Greens platform, where there is a push for like more affordable transit or moving towards free transit. So if we're thinking about like democratizing our public spaces, I think making sure people have access to movement is a huge part of that. And I think that I also think that, if we're thinking about Toronto as being a place where the Liberals and the NDP can both think that they can make gains, or, the Liberals can hold and the NDP can make gains, investing in TTC and sort of that being a cornerstone project could potentially be a big policy win or project win for them.
Thank you. John, go ahead.
So what I think is really important is for the federal government to connect climate and transit in a really intentional way. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I just want to sort of come back to it, that the large transit projects, subway projects, and the LRT projects that involve tunneling, take decade or more. And, we have to think about where we are relative to 2050 and where we are relative to 2030. I've argued for a while that we need to kind of break this cycle. It's a really path-dependent cycle of just endlessly building subways out into the hinterland. And subways use a lot of concrete. Concrete is a very high emitting material. And if you do the math and you look at the type of bus rapid transit service that can be delivered at the same cost as some of these rapid transit projects, you could have fantastic service, where people would not be waiting at all. And I really feel like that's the direction we need to go, particularly in sort of lower density areas, at the, in the older parts of the 416, and sort of the older inner suburbs, and then the 905 suburbs, where subways and higher order transit just are never going to make sense financially. So let's use the money in a way that actually moves people, in a way that's, where we can use electric buses and not spend a huge amount of money on concrete. So that's my point.
It's hard to imagine, but we do need to imagine cities beyond concrete and steel if we're thinking, in a climate-minded way, and especially where it comes to transit. We have another question. Oh, sorry, Shannon.
Sorry,
please,
I
go
did
ahead.
want to just jump in quickly just to say that I know that like we're focusing on like more urban environments, but I think that but sprawl is still a real reality, and a lot of developers are seeking to build out in municipalities that are less dense. And when you're seeing what is developed there, you're also what's also coming with it is younger people, you know what I mean, families with ideas on how to use the space. And so there's a desire for more active transportation and those opportunities to be built into you know, the low density communities. I live on the border of York Region and City of Toronto. And so I often traverse into the York Region area and I see people taking walks, riding their bike in these high traffic areas, streets that are mostly for capital goods movement. And so I think that while we're thinking about, you know, the density and those equations, we still have to be mindful of the fact that people have that desire to be able to walk to school, walk to the grocery store in communities that, you know, have a more of a, I guess, core periphery dynamic in terms of how they're built, where you have, you know, retail or commercial space on the outskirts, and then, you know, more more homes in one side of the city, for example, or like in the core of the city. And I think that we kind of have to respond to that even in our municipalities by providing transit options, because it does have implications for access to education, access to recreation. And I guess that is a community well-being piece as well overall. And so I'd love to see that, because you do see when you look at the policies of like the official plan policies of municipalities that are smaller, they're still mandating that high-rise buildings, if there is like a 4 or 5 story building, have 50% of the parking space requirement, yet everybody is anticipated to be a driver in that community. So there's still that, there's some regulations or design guidelines that are asking for something that is not going to materialize or make sense. And so how do you know what I mean? How do you respond to that? It's by adding active transportation and different mobility options that are greener and get people moving in a way that gives them more autonomy without being reliant on a car.
Yeah, we have to build the future we want to have, not sort of wait for it to somehow arrive.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to add something really quick to what Shannon said. You know, I was reading like the Liberal platform, and it said something like include transit in housing dense or area like population dense areas. And to me, that's like backwards, because we should be building transit wherever people are, and we can't have these these transit deserts. And we kind of see this in Toronto, especially within the inner suburbs, where the assumption is that they're all going to drive into the city. They live in, you know, less dense areas, so it doesn't make sense. It's not feasible. It's not to build transit out there. But there needs to be a push in kind of rethinking that and building for the future, where not everyone wants to drive. I live in the inner suburbs. I don't want to drive. So, and I want to be able to ride my bike or feel safe walking on the street. But, you know, in Scarborough and in North York, and Etobicoke have the highest rates of like pedestrian and cyclist deaths. So that's something to also think about.
Thank you. I do want to get this next question in because it raises some other questions that I didn't think got enough attention in the election myself. We have, what does the election have to tell us about the future of policing in Toronto? It seems to me when we're talking about policing in Toronto, we're also talking about discriminatory practices and uneven policing of public space and policing of certain bodies more than other. And it comes back to the question of the rise of you know, right-wing parties and some of their positions, which are sometimes explicitly white nationalist. I didn't find that, you know, the issues of race and racism and that kind of vision for Canada, including questions about reconciliation, really got enough airtime in this election campaign. And to me, they're broad issues, but they're fundamentally urban issues as well. So does anybody want to tackle this question in either a narrow or a broad sense of what does the election have to tell us about the future of policing in Toronto?
I just want to say that Bill Blair, who was the Toronto police chief, is still elected MP of Scarborough Southwest. So I think that doesn't bode well. And we saw it during the massive protests and the popular demand to defund the police. At the federal parliament, I think, was voting on a bill to ban the use of like tear gas and other kind of terrible tools, or I don't even know what to call them, weapons, on the civilian population, and the Liberal government voted against it. So I don't think we're in a good place.
Any other thoughts on that? John, please go ahead. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Shannon.
I was just
Please.
going to bring up just quickly that there was conversation about the Conservatives wanted to bring back mandatory minimums as a part of their platform. And so I think that there is a challenge, because I know the Liberal government has been working with the Black and Indigenous communities to kind of address the impact of mandatory minimums, and to, I guess, I'm not sure what the status of it is, but I guess it was alarming to hear that we have a national party that is interested in bringing that back without a consideration of the impacts on those who are disproportionately policed. Yeah, that's a bit scary.
Thank you. John.
So just a couple of things. I think that I'm hoping that the Liberals actually do come through on the significant promise to do the gun buyback. They've played politics around gun control, basically since they were elected. This commitment was sort of the most sort of forward-looking, but so they have to do that. They were going to spend like hundreds of millions of dollars on a buyback. They have to deal with gun smuggling, which I think is a big issue and contributes to gun violence in cities. And then, I mean, I think the other part of it is expanding the scope of drug legalization, because that produces a lot of incarceration of racialized people and Indigenous people, and it's unnecessary. And so they did legalize marijuana, which was good. And I think that there's more room on that in that space, and that will have an impact on policing, because it reduces the the space where criminality exists, and then there are all the benefits from that.
Are there any other issues that you think are important issues, either they're inherently urban issues or they're important specifically to the City of Toronto, that you felt did not actually get enough discussion or airtime during the campaign?
I think that I want to talk about immigration. So big cities, City of Toronto, Greater Toronto, are enormously benefited by immigration, and the immigration levels really slipped during the pandemic for all the for perfectly good reasons. So the federal government has said that they're going to increase the targets, and so we actually have to see that happens. But there's sort of there's two parts to that story, because I think that there's this long tradition of bait and switch with our immigration policies. So if the Liberals are going to say, okay, well, let's increase it to 400,000 or whatever the number was, they have to make sure that there's adequate housing for people who are coming into the country, either as immigrants or refugees, and then address some of the issues around credential recognition and around the ways that people are able to sort of become part of society and become able to sort of rejoin their professions, bring their families in, and so on. So as we kind of rebuild the immigration system after the pandemic, those are the other pieces that have to sort of come into play. And I don't know that they connect those dots as well as they should.
It's amazing how much of that could also all be addressed through better policy around international students in particular. and making it easier for that to turn into migration and permanent residency. Other thoughts of issues that did not get the airtime that they probably should have, or you would have liked them to? Shannon, any thoughts?
Honestly, I think I was just caught up in the whole, this election was interesting to me because it was in the middle of a pandemic. There's been a lot of new political movements that have risen out of it because of the pandemic and the measures taken to kind of manage and mitigate the the impact of COVID on our society. And so for me, it was any issue covered. It was more of how are we going to address the fragmentation? And I think that a lot of people kind of were viewing the I guess the leaders and what they had to say about the pandemic and felt disappointed or disheartened or felt like a new conversation about civil liberties was emerging. And I think that that's what's the most interesting thing. And I can't really speak on how they responded in terms of watching coverage of Trudeau or Jagmeet Singh or Erin O'Toole. But I think that was interesting. And then I also think of the fact that we get to see more of what Canadian values are, what Canadians actually think about gender rights. You see how Annamie Paul was kind of treated during the election and some of the challenges that she was facing in her party. And how that was kind of used against her by the other candidates. It's just more of a social commentary, but it does let you kind of see that we have a lot of work to do when it comes to gender and race and representation in our political landscape. And so I think about those two things the most. And, you know, Annamie did have a really great retort to Justin Trudeau, and she said, "You're not really a good feminist," you know, and I think that going forward, a lot of the things that we're discussing, transit, housing, all of those things, you know, will continue to shine a light on how women are treated in the country and where there are opportunities for women to raise their capital and be contributing to society meaningfully. Childcare is also a part of that. So that's kind of what I observed more than anything else.
Yeah, no, really important point, especially considering that the pandemic created this she session that, you know, disproportionately affected women on several fronts in terms of employment, but other issues too. Thank you. Saman, the last word to you on this.
Yeah, I think that I think both John and Shannon make great points. And one thing I thought about is why there needs, like, I come back to this because it's something that Progress Toronto is pushing for, but also I think the city of Toronto should be pushing for, but more of like a sustainable relationship with different, and the ability to like raise our own revenue to fund the projects that we need to at the city level. So, you know, there could be, I didn't see that. I was looking through all of the platforms, and there it's still kind of a cap in hand, capital project by capital project sort of commitment. Though, you know, I think that there's a moment that we can have. I don't know if there's like an appetite, or maybe it's too policy wonky for the parties to really adopt maybe a 1 cent on the GST kind of policy that former Mayor David Miller wanted. But we need something. I think that we're still in this cap in hand. Hope our best that the Liberals and the NDP and the Bloc can kind of decide on something. But municipalities do need to have their own revenue to make their own decisions, fund their own capital projects, and we're not seeing that. We're barely even seeing that through the operational costs, like operational sort of side of things. So obviously the city can do more in raising its own revenues in terms of the property taxes, but that's like, I think that's like one step, and the other big part of it is also making sure we have access to real revenue.
It's perhaps an unusual federal election that we weren't talking more about that kind of constitutional or potentially constitutional change. with that, I think we're going to bring it to a close. I want to thank, in particular, the City Institute and the Robarts Centre for Canadian Studies for organizing this, so especially to Linda Peake and Jean-Michel Monsian, the directors. Thank you very much. Thank you to Hazel and Alex also for all of their technical and organizational support in making today happen. Thanks to all of you who have joined us, and especially if you sent in some questions. And thanks most especially to the panelists for their really smart comments. I'm coming away feeling much more encouraged about the result of this election than I was a couple hours ago. So thank you for that. Best wishes to everyone for a lovely weekend, and hope to see you all again very soon. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Right, thank you.